This presentation is brought to you by American Civil War and UK history. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. If you're watching on YouTube and you like what you see, please remember to give us a big thumbs up. And remember to hit that subscribe button. And all the links to our website, podcast and social media pages can be found in the podcast description. Hello, I'm your host Daz, and joining me once again is historians Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging to discuss Ulysses S. Grant. In this episode we discuss Grant and his army crossing the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, the Inland Campaign, Vicksburg Campaign and right up to the Chattanooga Campaign. This is the Figures of the American Civil War podcast, Ulysses S. Grant, Episode 3, The Western Theatre, Part 2. And welcome to the podcast. And just a reminder that this is part 3 of a series of podcasts dedicated to Ulysses S. Grant. So if you would like to watch or listen to the previous 2 episodes, a link is available in the podcast description. And welcome back to Dr. Nathan Provost. Welcome, Nate.
Hey, how you doing, Darren?
And of course, historian Tim Willging. Welcome, Tim.
Hey, good to be here, Des.
Okay, so we left the previous episode and Grant and his army had crossed over to Bruinsburg and were just about to start the Inland Campaign, as it's known. So briefly summarize what took place between Grant's march from Bruinsburg to Jackson, Mississippi, Tim.
Okay, so Grant set off, with McClernand's Corps primarily, his 13th Corps, on May 1st, 1863, after having landed a couple days earlier at Bruinsburg. On May 1st, on that day, they engaged elements of John Bowen's Confederate division from Pemberton's army, which had been defending Grand Gulf at a place called Port Gibson. It was a pretty sharp fight. But ultimately, the McClernand's Corps, reinforced by one division of McPherson's 17th Corps, drove Bowen back. So at that time, Grant had already sent a message to Sherman to bring his 15th Corps from north of Vicksburg down to Hard Times and to cross to join the rest of the army. And Grant set off with basically a 3-pronged advance to the north. He gave orders to each of his 3 corps commanders, and this was going to be a 3-pronged advance. Once Sherman got there, to attack Edwards Station on the left, the westernmost objective. That would be McClernand's 13th Corps. Clinton, which was the easternmost on the right, with his 17th Corps, and then in the middle would be Sherman with his 15th Corps at a place called Midway Station. 9 days later, on May 10th, McPherson fought General John Gregg at Raymond. It was a pretty sloppy battle. And though McPherson did end up driving Gregg back to the north and east towards Jackson. And then finally, McPherson and Sherman met up and captured Jackson, which was the capital of which was and is the capital of Mississippi. That was being held by Joe Johnston, who was overall command in Mississippi at the time. He had been sending messages to Pemberton to come and join forces, but Pemberton was reluctant to do so, given the importance of Vicksburg as an obstacle denying federal control of the Mississippi River. It was a pretty sharp fight, but Grant's army pretty easily took the city and drove Johnson off to the north. At that point, McClernand was still off to the west along the railroad and Jackson Road running towards Vicksburg.
Okay, thanks, mate. And also, there's a battle at Champion Hill, which would you like to tell us a little bit about that, Tim, as well, about Champions Hill?
Sure. So Champions Hill followed the capture of Jackson on May 16th. Early in the morning on May 16th, McPherson's Corps engaged Confederates. Pemberton had moved to the east in the direction of Edwards Station, which was essentially halfway to Jackson, maybe a little bit more than halfway. Pemberton had posted Stephen D. Lee, who had been an artillery commander under Robert E. Lee before getting sent to Western Theater, atop Champion Hill, where they could watch for the Union movement moving towards a crossroad just to the west of Champions Hill at Edwards Station. If the Union were able to capture that while the Confederates were still east of there, obviously Grant could have bagged a large Confederate force there. Lee's men spotted the Union troops, and they were spotted in turn. And obviously Pemberton's really concerned that he would be cut off at that point. He had word that the Union troops were moving on his left, so that would have been McPherson's Corps. Grant arrived and ordered a simultaneous attack with McClernand on the left, attacking Loring's division of Pemberton's army, and McPherson would attack the center and right. McClernand's attacks were pretty ineffectual, and Grant frustratingly didn't hear much about McClernand much of the day. Due to that, and the Confederates were able to, they initially lost control of the crest of Champions Hill, and then the Confederates counterattack drove the Union back, but then they started making gains. Pemberton ordered Loring on his right to move and reinforce the left, and Loring was rather reluctant and basically ignored orders. Then finally, later in the day, he decided that he would obey Pemberton finally and moved in that direction. But the Confederates ultimately weren't able to stop the Union assault, and he ordered his men to fall back along. They actually only had one escape route open, a place called the Raymond Road running across a creek to the west called Baker's Creek. They held a rear guard. Lloyd Tileman, brigade commander, was in charge of rear guard, and he held as long as he could, and that cost him his life. The Confederates then were in full retreat back towards Vicksburg.
Okay, thanks, Tim. And I just want to remind everyone that myself and Tim did actually cover the Inland campaign in a podcast. So I'll leave a link to that in the description as well. So it's a bit more of an in-depth look at that whole campaign, because it's quite a long campaign. Was it possible for Grant to cut off Pemberton's force before making it back into Vicksburg, Tim?
Really only at Champions Hill, because after Confederates were in full retreat, they fought another battle on May 17th. So a day later at a place called the Big Black River, which is closer to Vicksburg. The Confederates had a 3-brigade rear guard, but by that point, most of the Confederate army was already back either in the fortifications or almost there. So really not much of an opportunity to cut them off after Champion Hill.
Okay, thanks, mate. And okay, so Nate, I'm going to bring you in now. So why did Grant opt to assault the city before laying siege to it?
Right. There are going to be two different assaults that will take place. One of them is going to be on the 19th of May. The other will be on the 22nd of May. And the first assault is largely out of necessity for Grant based upon the tempo and the information that he possessed at the time. He knew that Johnson was still in his rear, and he didn't want to give him the chance to coordinate an attack between Pemberton and Johnson. And the assault of May 19th was also the result of high morale, high tempo taking place because they just won 5 successive victories across Mississippi, and they wanted to keep up that tempo. Now, Grant also did not want to give the Confederates any time to refit or reinforce their position. However, by the time the Confederates got back to Vicksburg from the Battle of Big Black, they already had about 24 hours to reinforce their positions and refit, resupply before Grant's troops arrived. And also another huge issue for the Union Corps, 15th, 17th, and 13th, they did not understand or know the terrain very well leading up into Vicksburg. These I refer to them as Dr. Seuss hills because they're just so steep. It made it extremely difficult for both McClernand and McPherson's corps to make a determined attack. And in fact, neither one of them are really going to make a determined attack on the 19th. It's only going to be Sherman's corps that will attack on the 19th, but it's going to be repulsed very bloodily, and they'll stop and refit. Now, the assault on the 22nd of May was the result of men taking time to rest and resupply, at least for the Union soldiers, because they had to get supplies brought up. And in fact, they actually hadn't eaten for some time. So it was important to get food brought up to the Union soldiers, and they were able to do that through the occupation of Haynes Bluff, which is a very critical position for the Union at the time. So the men were now fed, but Grant almost wrongfully believed that his men still wanted to try again and assault the Confederate works. And he thought the morale was still high. Now, that could have been because they were just fed and they finally had a chance to rest. But ultimately, some of them felt like they could, some didn't. It's very difficult to make that determination. I will say, though, that Grant's plan to attack on the 27th is very, very well planned out. What he's going to order is he's going to order columns of soldiers to fix bayonet, march double quick against the fortifications, and not fire till they're at the parapets. And then once they breach the defenses, then they'll actually fan out inside of them. And Grant also made sure that everyone had set their watches to 10 a.m. to actually launch the assault. And then he even got Admiral David Porter involved by getting his Navy to fire on Vicksburg even 30 minutes after the initial time of the assault, just to weaken the Confederate defenses. Timothy B. Smith, who wrote maybe one of the best studies on the campaign itself, actually argued that it was the precursor to Emory Upton's assault at the Muleshoe a year later. Now, ultimately, unfortunately, no one in the 15th Corps or in McPherson's Corps were able to actually breach the Confederate defenses. They all got up to the parapet. Some of them were able to plant flags, but there was just no luck. And as Grant and Sherman were conferring about what just took place, a rider came up and gave Grant a note saying that McClernand is requesting reinforcements. He's breached the works. He wants to order another attack. And neither Grant or Sherman believe McClernand, but ultimately they reluctantly agreed to McClernand's proposal. But their instincts were right. McClernand had not breached the defenses. Again, he had gotten to the parapet, but he had not broken through the Confederate line. So ultimately, this is going to put McClernand Grant is not going to appreciate McClernand very much after this, like he had much appreciation before this anyway. But regardless, ultimately these two assaults turn out to be repulsed. But just a very quick note, and again, Timothy B. Smith is the one that makes this conclusion, which is, had either one of the assaults succeeded, the Battle of Gettysburg actually most likely never would have taken place, because it was largely a response to what was going on in Vicksburg. So it's interesting to think about these assaults. Grant ultimately is going to regret the assault on the 22nd of May, but to his credit, it was very well planned out.
Okay, thanks. How did Grant continue to surround the city and put pressure on Pemberton, Tim?
So after the assaults, Grant determines that he's going to commence siege operations, or as he says, out camp the enemy. Initially, he has a problem in that even though he has about 50,000 men in the three corps under Sherman on his right, McPherson in the middle, and McClernand on the left, that's not enough men to cover 12 miles of earthworks stretching from the river north of Vicksburg to the river south of Vicksburg. So Confederates for quite a while will have avenues of escape open to the south. But Pemberton obviously is unwilling to take that. So Grant's going to need more troops. So he petitions Halleck in Washington for reinforcements. The first to arrive will be a division of about 5,000 men from the Department of Missouri under a guy named Major General Francis J. Herron. These were remnants of the Army of the Frontier that had fought at Pea Ridge, I think earlier that year, or in 1862. Then came 3 divisions from Grant's own 16th Corps, which had been primarily in Memphis. That was led by Cadwalader C. Washburn, and they arrived a day later on June 12th. And then finally, the 9th Corps, which is bounced around at that time, was in the Department of the Ohio, was about 8,000 men strong, arrived under the command of Major General John Parke. They arrived on the 14th. At that point, Grant had about 77,000 men, and that completed the encirclement of Vicksburg. All the while, the Union Navy on the river is able to shell Vicksburg regularly.
Okay, so eventually Pemberton is going to decide to surrender. So, but why does he decide to surrender, Tim?
Ultimately, because he isn't. He doesn't have confidence that Joe Johnston's going to arrive with reinforcements. Johnson still has recovered, has moved back to Jackson, has about 15,000 men, or upwards of 15,000 men. That's a concern for Grant, so he detaches, puts the 9th Corps off to his east, puts Sherman, or reinforces it, gives Sherman overall command of that attempt, but Johnston never comes. So he had plenty of ammunition, but he didn't have a lot of food, and that lack of food, both for his men, for the civilians, was causing a problem. Half his men were sick with diseases from scurvy, malaria, dysentery, cutting into his strength. And he's under constant shelling. The gunboats alone are firing almost 22,000 shells into the city. That's combined with Grant's own artillery from across his siege lines. So at that point, between disease, the encirclement, no prospect for reinforcement, Pemberton decides to capitulate.
So Pemberton obviously knew Grant, didn't he, from the Mexican War? So how was that for both of them coming up against each other? Did they know each other really well?
I don't think they knew each other really well. Pemberton was a distinguished artillery officer. Grant was in the infantry. I think they knew of each other. Grant probably had the more negative reputation, obviously. Most people knew that he'd had issues before the war with drinking. But it was not much. It was not a similar moment to Grant's excitement at meeting Lee at Appomattox, wondering if Lee remembered him. Grant didn't hold Pemberton in that same regard.
Okay, thank you. Okay, how did the capture of Vicksburg affect the overall Union strategy? Was Gettysburg or Vicksburg more significant, Nate?
Yeah, sorry, just to kind of hit on that previous question you just asked, I do just want to also mention this is not going to be the last time Pemberton and Grant actually face each other either. Pemberton is actually going to go east, and he's going to be under the command of Robert E. Lee during the Battle of Fort Harrison in the Eastern Theater. So that's just kind of like a small little tidbit there. So they haven't heard of the last of each other just yet. Now, as far as the overall strategy is concerned, Grant is going to oversee one of the greatest Union victories of the war at Vicksburg. And it was considered impregnable by all accounts. Now, the capture of Vicksburg did not cut off all trade from Western Confederate states, but the Union Navy could largely operate along the Mississippi River without issue. And in fact, during the Battle of Cold Harbor, Robert E. Lee at one point suggests getting more horses from Texas. So clearly, if this is the case, then obviously they can still resupply across the river from time to time, but that's quite the distance. Now, the second important piece of this is that it brought Grant back into this national spotlight once again, because remember, after the Battle of Shiloh, Grant's star really fell, largely because of the high casualty count. Halleck put him second in command, and then he obviously had control over a few battles here and there, but really they weren't of any strategic significance. And so the capture of Vicksburg, though, is really going to bring him back into the spotlight. So much so that Halleck is going to develop this great appreciation for Grant, along with Lincoln. And I also don't want to downplay the defeat of Lee at Gettysburg, because it clearly raised the spirits of the Army of the Potomac, and after so many stalemates and defeats on the battlefields of the Eastern Theater, it definitely reinvigorated the Army of the Potomac. And certainly veterans of that battle remembered it very, very well and wrote about it extensively. And obviously, both of you know just how often it's written about. But beyond that, on the strategic scale, it did very little. Some Confederate soldiers actually left Gettysburg with the notion that they won, which is kind of a crazy thought, but they did. Some of them thought that they had won. I do imagine it brought in quite a lot of political support for the Lincoln administration and the continuation of the war effort. But if we're talking about grand strategy, Vicksburg is just clearly more significant.
Yeah, definitely. What did Grant want to do after the capture of Vicksburg, and what was his next target, Nate?
Yeah, so this was a much less talked about scheme, and it's been written very little about it has been written. But Grant ordered Sherman to go and retake Jackson, Mississippi, because it was reoccupied by Confederate forces. And this was considered the Jackson expedition, and it was an attempt to drive all the Confederate forces out of Mississippi. Grant did not oversee this expedition, but definitely gave Sherman the go-ahead to go and take Jackson. And it's a very grueling march for Sherman because there was very little water for his men to drink. And the Confederates actually set up a very strong defensive position around the city. and they were hoping Sherman would just launch a direct assault against the city. But Sherman did not take the bait on this and ordered artillery positions to be built around the city, and they began to envelop it. The only Union assault that actually took place there was further south on Edward Ord's line. He took over McClernand's corps during the siege of Vicksburg after he was sacked by Grant. Miscommunication is going to take place between Edward Ord and one of his subordinates that resulted in a bloody assault on the southern ridge of the city. Ord did immediately fire that brigadier general, and there was just like light skirmishing that continued. Johnson attempted to try to cut off Sherman's supply running through Champion Hill, but Sherman had already sent infantry to actually protect the wagon trails and fought the Confederate cavalry. And Johnson retreated 40 miles east to Morton, Mississippi afterwards. Now, one thing to note, the reason why I want to mention this is because of the fact that this expedition really proved Sherman capable and independent command. Up to this point, I mean, Sherman keeps proving his worth to Grant, both at the tactical and operational level, and Grant keeps giving more and more responsibility to Sherman, and that relationship is really going to be what brings this war to its final conclusion.
Excellent, thanks, mate. Okay, so let's move our attentions quickly, if we can, to the Army of the Cumberland and William Rosecrans and the Battle of Chickamauga, which takes place in September of 1863. Tim, do you want to tell us what took place during the Battle of Chickamauga?
Well, sorry. Okay. So to begin with, a little bit of background. Towards the end of June, following the Battle of Stones River, the situation in Middle Tennessee basically remained stagnant, with Rosecrans facing off against Bragg's Army of Tennessee. Beginning at the end of June, in a relatively bloodless campaign, Rosecrans rather brilliantly maneuvers Bragg out of position, forcing him to withdraw all the way back to Chattanooga. He basically, towards the end of August, beginning of September, he does it again, basically maneuvers Bragg out of Chattanooga, forcing him to fall back into North Georgia. And then he's trying to, once across the Tennessee River, there, Chattanooga and into North Georgia, they're kind of grasping towards each other. Bragg has a chance to ambush one of Rosecrans' corps, but fails in that. And the Battle of Chickamauga begins on the 19th of September. It's 3 days. Ultimately, Bragg is able to achieve, some would say, a lucky breakthrough when Rosecrans withdraws Wood's division to reinforce George Thomas on the Union left, opening a gap that just so happens to be the location where Longstreet, who has arrived from Virginia, is currently attacking. So Longstreet comes plowing into this gap, and that basically throws the Union Army into retreat. And George Thomas does conduct a rearguard action based essentially on Snodgrass Hill, earning himself the sobriquet of the Rock of Chickamauga. The rest of the Union Army falls back on Chattanooga.
Okay, thanks, mate. Where does the Union Army retreat following the Battle of Chickamauga, and why does the situation seem grim for the Army of the Cumberland, Tim?
So initially they take up positions in and around Chattanooga, to include on Missionary Ridge, but then they ultimately abandon that and fall back into defenses directly surrounding Chattanooga, giving up the high ground. Rosecrans elects not to fortify Lookout Mountain, which is just basically southwest of Chattanooga. So Confederates seized that position. Some units on Missionary Ridge aren't given the withdrawal order and are captured as the Confederates surround them. But the Confederates also secure Missionary Ridge. So in the course of setting up this semi-encirclement of Chattanooga that cuts all but one very circuitous supply route, and in fact, Joe Wheeler's cavalry raids on one occasion the Union supply route that's coming from the north and west, and that causes supplies to really dwindle to a trickle in Chattanooga.
Okay. Why is the Lincoln administration are so concerned about the Union force inside Chattanooga, and what else is going on in East Tennessee at that time, Nathan?
Right. So on the 4th of November, Bragg is actually going to order Longstreet to take command of 2 divisions to recapture Knoxville. Ambrose Burnside took control of East Tennessee in September of 1863 after taking command of the Army of Ohio. Just keep in mind, Ambrose Burnside, he is largely responsible for the defeat at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and so he actually comes out west, has command of the Army of Ohio. But East Tennessee is kind of an interesting region because it had a lot of Union support with very few people residing there that supported secession. And more importantly, it was a very rough terrain, and it's very, very difficult to march armies across it, along with just simply supplying them. So if the Confederates were actually able to reoccupy this region, it would set the war effort back months. Burnside is actually going to face little resistance actually taking Knoxville. But the concern now is with Longstreet's detachment from Bragg, if he regains this region from Burnside, it may prove difficult to recapture. So not only did the Lincoln administration believe that the Army of the Cumberland needed saving, but Eastern Tennessee needed to be protected as well. And the only way that was possible was by actually saving the Army of the Cumberland inside Chattanooga. Because as soon as they were able to relieve Chattanooga, they could move quickly to Knoxville to relieve Burnside's force. So Halleck and Stanton, they're going to continually message Grant about the progress of events while at Chattanooga, reminding him almost daily what needs to get done. So there's a lot of pressure coming from the top on Grant. So Grant is ready to take action. And in fact, Grant in turn wanted to actually attack Bragg's position on Missionary Ridge as early as November 7th. However, a few of his officers, that being of William Baldy Smith and Thomas, they looked at that position. They thought it was too strong to attack without support, and Grant decided to postpone that attack.
Okay, so obviously Grant is going to come east, and his arrival at Chattanooga, and of course, it's known as well that him and Rosecrans never really got on. How does he change up the command structure, Nate?
Right. So one thing, a bit of background. Grant and Rosecrans' rapport with one another started back in 1862, and their relationship really spiraled after the Battle of Iuka for reasons that are really unclear for the most part. But Grant was never fond of Rosecrans, and Rosecrans was never fond of Grant, and that really lasted until the day both of them died. So when this is all taking place, obviously, Grant has no support of Rosecrans staying in command, but it really starts with Charles Dana. He's going to be responsible for writing to Lincoln and other members in the Lincoln administration, saying that Rosecrans should be removed from command after he lost his nerve at the Battle of Chickamauga. It's not really the case, uh, but he lost favor with the Lincoln administration, and Grant got the support from Stanton to remove him from command. Um, and ultimately, he's going to replace Rosecrans with George Thomas to put in charge of the command of the Army of the Cumberland. And George Thomas was very competent. Tim already noted how he commanded the rear guard action at Chickamauga very ably, and he won an early victory at the Battle of Mill Springs as well. So he already had some fame with that. But when Grant actually arrived at Thomas's headquarters on the 23rd of October, there's a lot of different accounts as to what took place. The most famous of these accounts is probably James Wilson's account, where Grant comes in cold, he's broken his leg, and Thomas coldly receives him. He's not really paying much attention to Grant. He doesn't help him out. But then there's other accounts like even Badeau's account, uh, in which case Thomas did get him warm clothes and addressed him as such. He was a little bit embarrassed about it, but that was really the all that took place. And for some reason, this is hotly debated among historians. I think it gains too much attention it doesn't really deserve. I think Dave Powell has it right in his book on the subject. Um, Simply that James Wilson's account isn't corroborated with any other surviving accounts of that. Um, but Grant is actually going to work with Thomas as well as he probably could. Um, and they'll discuss plans about the campaign. They'll talk about opening up the Cracker Line, and always consider Thomas's input.
Okay, thanks. And I'm glad you mentioned Dave Powell because if you want a more in another podcast plug, if you want another more in-depth look, I did do the Chattanooga campaign with Dave Powell a few years back, and I will also leave that link in the description. But back to you, Tim. How does Grant open up the supply lines for Chattanooga in the first place?
So that's when we talk about the reopening of the supply lines at Chattanooga, we're talking about this thing called the Cracker Line. And this was the brainchild of the chief engineer of the Army of the Cumberland, William F. Baldy Smith, who had formerly served in the Army of the Potomac until just after Fredericksburg. He basically devised with Rosecrans a plan to open a supply line, basically taking control of a ferry west of Chattanooga, because the river kind of forms a U, then goes back up along Lookout Mountain and then swings west. That U is a place called Moccasin Point. So get across Moccasin Point some way, somehow. Then at this ferry on the other side of the U from Chattanooga called Brown's Ferry, if you can secure that, you control or can move into Lookout Valley, which is to the north. And beyond that is another ferry from which Union supply boats coming from Bridgeport, Alabama, along the Tennessee can get to that ferry location. And that basically cuts down the supply route substantially. Problem is while Rosecrans knew about it, he never put it into execution at all. Upon being relieved on Grant's order by Thomas, Thomas decides he's going to put it in. Grant's briefed on it by Smith as soon as he gets there, and Grant enthusiastically approves it. So once again, it will connect Bridgeport, Alabama to Kelly's Ferry on the other side of Lookout Mountain, Raccoon Mountain, and then roads basically connect to Brown's Ferry, and then you can bring the via pontoons that are built or would be built, bring supplies in, as opposed to sending supplies way north from Bridgeport and then back down through that circuitous route. So Smith puts this plan into action after Grant's approval. The command is one of the more distinguished, it's given to one of the more distinguished commanders from the Army of the Cumberland, General William Hazen. His men basically float down the river and silently secure Brown's Ferry. It's relatively bloodless. Bragg learns about it, tries to order Longstreet to do something about it over the next couple days, but he doesn't. And when he does attack, he attacks. Let me back up a second. At the same time, and we haven't discussed this, there are significant reinforcements coming to reinforce the garrison or the Army of the Cumberland in Chattanooga. First is Sherman's coming with the Army of the Tennessee, but also 2 Union Corps from the Army of the Potomac, the 11th and 12th, are coming and are at I think Bridgeport, but they're moving from the west towards Chattanooga, towards the rear of Lookout Mountain, under the command of Joe Hooker, former commander of the Army of the Potomac. So Longstreet does have a fight with the 12th Corps at a place called Wauhatchie. He only attacks with like a division, with the brigade. Actually, hold on. He's attacking with, I think, Vanderlaw's brigade and Micah Jenkins's division from Lookout Mountain. That was a nighttime attack, one of the few nighttime battles of the war, and the Confederates are ultimately repulsed. So that basically, the Cracker Line was opened. Hazen's movement was on the 27th. The Battle of Wauhatchie was, I think, a day or two later. On the 28th, the evening of the 28th, about 10 o'clock, that battle kicked off. But ultimately it was a failure, and the Cracker Line's open, and Union supplies are able to come in from the west, from Bridgeport into Chattanooga.
Excellent. And I'm glad you brought up all of those engagements, because my good friend Gina Denham's great-great-grandfather took part in all of those battles, or little fights that took place, especially the Wauhatchie one. Okay, so what is Grant's tactical plan to drive back Bragg's forces, and what is the disposition of the Confederate Army at this point, Nathan?
Right. So I just want to reiterate what Tim was talking about, which is the Army of the Potomac in the Eastern Tier did detach the 11th and 12th Corps under General Joe Hooker. Grant's going to order up the Army of Tennessee under the command of William Sherman. The Army of the Cumberland was already present in Chattanooga under the command of Thomas. And with all these armies, Grant was actually planning on a double envelopment of Bragg's position on Missionary Ridge. And Sherman is going to try to take the right flank of the Confederate Army to the northwest across the Tennessee River. And he's going to try to get after a range of hills there that he thinks is one entire hill, but really it's a couple, and I'll get into that here in just a minute. But it was the purpose of Sherman's movement ultimately was to cut off Bragg's line of retreat with the majority of the Army of Tennessee. Then in the initial plans, Grant and Thomas actually wanted to capture Lookout Mountain. However, Grant had second thoughts, and he initially scrapped that idea because he wanted the full weight of the attack with Sherman. But due to changing positions with the Confederate forces, and then Osterhaus's division being stranded in Lookout Valley, Grant actually revived the plan to take Lookout Mountain with Joe Hooker leading the attack. They will capture Lookout Mountain on November 24th, and this is actually going to revive Joe Hooker's reputation after his defeat at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Osterhaus's division will take part. They were a part of the Army of Tennessee, but because obviously they were stuck there, they were with the Army of the Potomac at that time. Now, some of the soldiers actually did recount when they were taking Lookout Mountain that the fog greatly helped hinder the enemy's ability to actually fire on them. So they gave quite a bit of credit to the fog that was there when they were advancing up the mountain. But on the 25th, they were actually Joe Hooker's forces were actually supposed to cross Chattanooga Creek, but they were stalled trying to rebuild the bridges there. And Sherman's Army of Tennessee crossed the Tennessee River on November 24th, and they thought they successfully took the hill, but they thought again it was one continuous hill, which it wasn't. It was actually two. So Sherman and his men actually captured what was called Billy Goat Hill, but they did not capture what was called Tunnel Hill. And this was a very important area to hold because Patrick Cleburne, who is this brilliant division commander in the Confederate Army, he's actually going to occupy that hill and hold off Sherman's attack on the 25th. And he's going to successfully repulse multiple attacks made against his position. And not only that, he'll actually order counterattacks against Sherman's corps as well, preventing him from actually taking Tunnel Hill. And so that all that left then was the Army of the Cumberland in the center to assault Missionary Ridge, because Grant initially said that the Army of the Cumberland would either divert forces away from the Confederate right, or they would take Missionary Ridge itself.
Okay, thanks, mate. And okay, so does Grant actually order the assault at Missionary Ridge himself, Nate?
Yeah, this one raises quite a few contentious points in the Civil War community based on contradictory sources. But the reason why there's this contradiction is it largely has to do with the rivalry that exists between the Army of the Cumberland, the Army of the Tennessee, and to an extent, even the Army of the Potomac. So we need to remember that the battles around Chattanooga brought in obviously 6 different armies into Tennessee. So it was Grant's intention. I mean, it was his initial intention to get at Bragg's right flank during the Battle of Missionary Ridge. He was hoping that the Army of Tennessee would outflank his position there. Now, this obviously doesn't happen, and it's going to be reported by James Wilson, Philip Sheridan, and others in their memoirs after the war that they were only ordered to take the rifle pits in the front. Now, one of the issues with this, and this is primarily coming from Phil Sheridan's account, which is that Phil Sheridan actually is unsure what he heard, and the sound of the guns to order the assault actually went off before he could get clarity on the full orders of the assault. So the sources that tend to corroborate the fact that Grant ordered this assault was Montgomery Meigs, I believe. You can correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. He actually is the one that said afterwards that Grant did order the soldiers to take the rifle pits at the base of the Missionary Ridge, but they were supposed to reform and then advance. And Grant had already said a couple days prior that they would either divert soldiers away or they would attack the ridge itself. And ultimately, that was Grant's intention all along. Now, there's another account that states, well, Grant got very upset when he when he saw soldiers moving up the ridge. And this could be the case, but it also could more likely be the case that he was upset that they didn't reform at the base of the ridge, and then it wasn't an orderly attack. And ultimately, the soldiers will take the ridge. They just didn't reform, and you might think that it would be asinine to actually pause at the base of this ridge and say, okay, well, let's form up and assault the ridge. Well, Tim correctly pointed out to me just a couple days ago that it actually would have been very, very difficult for the Confederates to fire down on those rifle pits from their current position. So it would have actually been okay for the Union soldiers at the base of the ridge to actually reform and then advance upwards. So ultimately, Grant knew that the Army of the Cumberland was this last opportunity, and even putting all that aside, and let's just say Grant was unsure of what would take place, or he simply wanted to take the rifle pits to divert attention away, he ultimately created his own luck, and ultimately it led to this astounding victory. It was very, very impressive. So Grant already had an idea in his head that, yes, the Army of the Cumberland would be responsible for attacking the front of Bragg's forces.
Okay, thanks a lot. And so what does Grant do immediately following the battles around Chattanooga, Nate?
Yeah, so we need to think of Grant at this time as an Army group commander. So he's really thinking operations and strategy at this point. And obviously, there was this certain push to win a quick victory at Chattanooga because, again, the Lincoln administration was deeply concerned about East Tennessee at the time in the face of James Longstreet's force besieging Ambrose Burnside's army in Knoxville. And poor Sherman here. Grant's going to order Sherman to march to Knoxville after they just took a very rough beating there at Chattanooga to go relieve Burnside's forces. Luckily, when they arrived, Burnside had already repulsed Longstreet and had forced Longstreet to actually retreat. So Sherman's forces could just relax, and they didn't have to do anything when they got there. But again, Grant had no way of knowing that was going to be the result or the outcome of that. So there was this concern that Grant had about wanting to either capture or destroy Bragg's force in the field, which is a very difficult thing to do. But Grant is thinking in bigger terms at this point, right? We've seen him move from this belief in the decisive battle, forcing the Confederates to capitulate after a really bloody and decisive battle. Well, that's just not the case. And he certainly realizes this a little bit before the Vicksburg campaign. So now he's thinking in much larger terms. He's thinking about the politics involved. And also not long after this, both him and Sherman are thinking about moving against Alabama. They want to take Alabama out of the war as well. And that's actually why Sherman goes on his Meridian campaign. It was, again, part of Grant's raiding strategy. And it reinvigorates Sherman and brings quite a bit of success for the Union forces as well.
Okay, yeah, and another great victory. And I understand as well that a lot of guys went up Lookout Mountain and had photographs taken, including Grant himself. And there are some great ones out there. So just Google it and they'll come up. I know Grant did do that himself. Yeah, sorry.
Just a quick note about that. It's interesting that there are pictures of him there on Lookout Mountain, because in his memoirs he says it's all poetry, and the reality is that ultimately it wasn't. It was this really, it was really impressive. And I think a lot of what Grant said about Lookout Mountain had to do, again, with a lot of the rivalries and relationships he had with other commanders. I think one thing Grant probably forgot to think about was the fact that one of the Army of Tennessee's divisions took part in that battle, and that was Osterhaus's division. And Grant had quite a bit of respect for Osterhaus as a division commander. So I think he actually forgot about that.
Mhm. Okay, following this battle, Grant goes east to develop new plans to break the rebellion. But up to this point, how do you assess Grant's generalship in the Western Theatre, Nate?
Yeah, Tim, feel free to comment on this as well. But and obviously you can correct me here if you would like. Um, but personally, I think that Grant shows a lot of aptitude for the three levels of war, that being tactical, operational, and strategic. He shows very strong tactical abilities, I think, at Fort Donelson and Shiloh. Operationally, there's nothing more brilliant than the Vicksburg campaign. He also did very, very well, especially in 1863, aligning strategy with politics, which is not something a lot of generals succeeded with. And this is where, you can begin making connections between Eisenhower and Grant as generals as well. But there was also a developmental phase for him because he had to learn to abandon this old idea of decisive battle. And keep in mind, there were officers through the entire Civil War that never gave up the idea of decisive battle. And in fact, French generals, really up until World War One, I mean, they really continued believing in that, Napoleonic victory. Okay, um, so that was definitely a learning curve for him, but luckily he at least had that learning curve. Uh, it, and it's unclear when exactly he changed his uh, beliefs about the decisive battle, but it was sometime when he was trying to protect Corinth, I believe. One of the biggest criticisms I probably have of him, though, was largely had to do with his overconfidence, and I think that's very prevalent during the assaults on the 22nd of May. I think sometimes it caused probably some unnecessary casualties. Um, but what seems odd about Grant is that most of his ideas in the Western theater seem to be very, very common sense, right? I mean, these orders, I mean, it seems like, okay, yeah, that makes total sense why he would order that. But it just was so rare among Army commanders, especially within the Union ranks at the time. So we have to question, is it common sense or is it genius? And it probably is both to an extent. But at the operational and strategic levels, Grant continued to remain undefeated in the Western Theater, and that's probably why the Lincoln administration brought him east, because the Eastern Theater was just a mess. um, but it's possible his only tactical defeat was at Belmont. But that's, I know, is still debated upon if it was a raid or not. Um, but I think he also had very strong abilities, like the Duke of Wellington. Actually, was establishing a very strong intelligence system um, that was extraordinarily effective, and it helped him win a series of victories in the Western Theater, including Forts Henry and Donelson, as well as Vicksburg.
Hmm. Are there any significant events in the Western Theatre that generally speak to his abilities as a general, Nathan?
Um, I think there's quite a few, but a couple that really speak to me is, and again, this is just going to my current writing and in the book that me and Tim are working on currently. But it's this coup d'oeil that he has at places like Fort Donelson and Chattanooga, ordering these attacks against Confederate works, knowing the right time when to attack, and make that decisive decision. And it brought him these victories that greatly aided the northern efforts, especially with the Lincoln administration and their political and military objectives. Um, but his defensive line at Shiloh was impressive. running batteries past Vicksburg and then winning 5 victories in a matter of weeks to then take Vicksburg is something in any commander in history rarely does. And I think these abilities are just in events are just extraordinarily impressive.
Yeah, totally agree. Okay, what do you think modern militaries should take away from from his campaigns in the West, Tim?
So I think over the course of his campaigns in the West, Grant becomes uh, particularly adept at employing what we would call operational art today. Now, at the time, Grant would have maybe understood the term grand tactics, which was the level of war between tactics, the actions on the battlefield, and strategy, which are those political objectives set by a nation's leaders. And operational art and the operational level are technically different, whereas operational level refers to that ability or that middle level of war between tactics and strategy. Operational art is a little bit different. Now, the operational level in the United States and in Britain really wasn't a thing until really the 1980s. The concept was really developed by the Soviets in the 1920s and 30s as a way to connect tactics and strategy up through World War II, from World War I through World War II. In the U.S., we would refer to it as minor strategy, but that did get confusing doctrinally with words like minor tactics, major tactics, grand tactic, or minor strategy and major strategy. But you could see people grasp that there was something there, whether it was grand tactics or minor strategy. So in the 1980s, we basically settled on in our doctrine the operational level of war, and it made its way into schoolhouses and officer training. Now, operational level war is concerned with time, space, means, whereas operational art is what's the best way to say it? It's defined by its military and political scope, not necessarily by its force size. It's a tool set, whereas the operational level talks more about structure. So when we talk operational level of war, we're talking about what I think Grant really demonstrated was his ability to master what we would call the elements of operational art. These are the tools used to create that balance between time, space, means as well. So this has kind of been on brain for a few years now. So what are these things, and how does Grant do them? So looking at these elements, you have like end state and conditions would be one. Let's look at Vicksburg, or start at Donelson. He knew that if he took Fort Donelson, that would basically sever the Confederacy, or force the Confederates to abandon Middle Tennessee. And sure enough, he takes Fort Henry and Donelson, and that unhinges the Confederate lines. He knew that if he took Vicksburg, he would, he had his desired end state to basically clear Mississippi, and he does that when Sherman pushes Joe Johnston back out of Jackson after the fall of Vicksburg. Center of gravity. Once again, Grant clearly understood that. He understood that Fort Donelson, and he got that early, Fort Donelson, Fort Henry would unhinge the Confederate position. Similarly, after he took Vicksburg, Union control over Mississippi was a sure thing. Lines of operation. These are the, how to move on objectives. You can look at his three-pronged advance towards Jackson. Basing. He's super concerned about logistics. and that's a similar term for basing. One of his key points before he can launch his assault on Vicksburg is he has to capture Haynes's Bluff, which will allow him to supply his army with a continuous supply line coming from Memphis. Tempo, that is basically keeping up the pace of operations. So look at Vicksburg, and you understand that following the onset of the Inland Campaign, these operations just move. He goes from Bruinsburg, wins Port Gibson, captures Jackson after winning Raymond, moves off, pushes Pemberton all the way back to Vicksburg. Transitions and phasing, I basically just went over that. Culmination, basically, at what point is he going to stop? Well, that's after he clears Mississippi. Operational reach, basically, operational reach is one of the more difficult ones, but that's basically the ideal distance and duration, and it is a fine line that, it requires a deft touch. But what is that distance and duration over which your forces can utilize their full capabilities? I think he doesn't go too far in his operations, whether it's Donelson, or the Vicksburg campaign. He doesn't overextend himself. And finally, risk. I think Grant's a master of that. The movement south, to Hard Times and then across to Bruinsburg, that was risky. But what is the appropriate level of risk that you need to mention? So I think what modern militaries can learn from Grant, particularly in the West, and especially the Vicksburg campaign, which is as close to, nothing's perfect, but it's as close to the perfect Civil War campaign, and that's what you're talking about at the operational level. It's to understand that perhaps Grant would establish himself as the father of operational art and a worthy person to emulate and study.
Okay, thanks a lot, Tim. Yeah, excellent. And so we're going to leave it there for now. And of course, we will be following Grant east in another episode in the near future. I just want to say thank you, Nathan. Thank you for coming on again.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And thank you, Tim.
My pleasure.
And of course, as mentioned, the previous 2 episodes, the link will be in the description. Myself and Tim, as I said, did the Vicksburg campaign in a bit more detail. And I did have a really good chat with Dave Powell a few years back about the Chattanooga campaign. So they'll all be in the podcast description. But all that is left to say is cheers. Thank you for watching or listening to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast, which was brought to you by American Civil War and UK History. A big thanks to Dr. Nathan Provost and Tim Willging. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give us a big thumbs up and remember to hit the subscribe button. You can find links to all of our podcasts, including episode 1 and episode 2 of Ulysses S. Grant, or for a more in-depth look at the battles of Fort Henry, Donelson, the middle part of the Vicksburg campaign and the Chattanooga campaign, as well as many more, please head over to our website where you will find links. There you will also find blog posts and links to all of our social media pages. A link can be found in the podcast description. And a massive shout out and thank you to Cody C, Engdahl, who performed and allowed us to use his piece of violin music, Battle Cry of Freedom. Not only is Cody a musician, but he's also an author of a series of fictional novels set during the American Civil War. You will find the links to Cody's books in the show's description. Alternatively, you will find them on Amazon. All that is left to say once again, ladies and gentlemen, is thank you for listening to the Figures of the American Civil War podcast. Cheers.